Good afternoon. Before addressing the topic of natural law ethics, I would like to say just a few brief words about approaches in ethics, a quick tour d'horizon. There are two basic approaches which we may call absolutist and positivist or positivistic. We have to be a little bit careful because the word absolute, absolutist in English usually has a very negative sound when we talk about political absolutism. Well, put that out of your mind and recognize that we are speaking here in a technical sense, and it has quite a different meaning. Also, the term positive, positivistic, tends to mean good as opposed to negative or negativistic, but here too it has a special meaning which I will explain. First, absolutist ethical systems assume that there are certain principles that are universally applicable without regard to time, place, or situation. There are several different ways to arrive at an ethical system of this type. A positivistic ethics assumes that ethics are posited, from the Latin term positus, which means placed or set. Ethics are positive, set up, put in place by human authorities. And here too, there are two basic types. I'd like to say a few things about the so-called absolutist ethical systems. The first of these that I want to mention has the technical name metaphysical moralism. That is to say, a moral code that comes from beyond the physical range, that is, perhaps from the area of the divine. This ethical system is also known as divine command ethics, and there is a good biblical precedent for this. Micah chapter 6, verse 8, "He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God." In other words, God has shown us what is right. It is also possible to have a divine command ethic that is not specifically based on a written scripture. For example, in the book of the prophet Daniel, in chapter 6, we read about the effort of the Persian satraps to catch Daniel in a fault. And they went to the king of the Persians, to the Shah, and said to him, "Live forever, O king, and then make a law according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not change." Now, when as a small boy I had this story read to me and heard about the king who thought that he could make a law which couldn't be changed, I thought this was a kind of royal arrogance. Actually, however, it reflects a different point of view, namely the idea that the king cannot make laws as he wishes, but he must always expound the law, which is the will of heaven. And for that reason, once he has ventured to do this, he cannot simply change it. So we find this attitude in biblical thinking, we find it in Muslim thought, we find it in the Aryan thought of the Persians, and you find something similar even in ancient Chinese thought, where there is a good deal of concern about the will of heaven. The second absolutist ethical system is known as deontological ethics. It's associated with the name of Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804. The ethics of necessary being, or of absolute necessity, the ethics of the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is the command or injunction that is always binding on an individual under all circumstances. It's to be distinguished from what is called a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is an injunction that is binding only under specific circumstances. Let us say, for example, in the case of the Second World War, Britain and France guaranteed that they would go to war against Germany if Germany invaded Poland. Germany did invade Poland, and Britain and France did go to war against Germany. But Britain and France were not under a general obligation to go to war against Germany, only because the treaty had been made and the conditions were fulfilled. The fundamental principles of deontological ethics are really two. The first is the principle of universifiability. Act according to that maxim which you could wish to be universally applied. In other words, all laws should in principle be universally applicable. And the second is the concept that human beings may never be used as means, must always be regarded as ends. Now, the third of the absolutist ethical systems that we'd like to look at is natural law ethics. Since that is our principal topic, we will postpone our consideration of that and take for just a minute a look at positivistic ethical systems. Now, the term positivism, used in ethics and in law, can represent either a method or actually be the name of a particular system. As a method, the positivistic approach says that it is we human beings who set up laws. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first example is called ethical relativism, which says, in effect, that all ethical principles are relative to various things, to time, to place, to culture, to situations. We can divide this into 2 types. One type is called cultural relativism. I have here the name of an opera, Così fan tutti, which more or less means it's the way they all do it, or they all do it that way, that a thing is right or wrong depending on whether it is done in a particular culture. Individual relativism, we have here a song from an opera, Fledermaus, Chacun a son goût. I believe in the French expression, chacun a son goût, everyone according to his taste. In other words, you don't consider whether a thing is right in the general culture, you consider whether it is right for you. I've added here the German expression, jedem das seine, which translates chacun a son goût, to each his own. And this expression was over the gate of a couple of the German concentration camps erected by the Nazis. It's kind of interesting that individual relativism, if taken to its logical conclusion, might lead to that. A second positivistic system is that of utilitarianism, which operates on the basis of the good being the choice for the greater good of the greater number, or as I've written here, the greatest good of the greatest number. Here again we have 2 types. We have the type that is called rule utilitarianism, in which something called the hedonistic calculus, that is a calculation concerning the degree of pleasure that can be obtained or pain that can be avoided by particular action. The hedonistic calculus is applied to determine that which is good in general for the general public, and thereby a rule is established. Act utilitarianism limits this calculation to the specific act, so it doesn't establish general rules. In every particular case, you look at the specific act. The third variety that we look at very briefly here is called situation ethics, and this essentially says that there are no general rules, but everything depends upon the situation. Now, obviously, in a particular situation, you have to have some standard by which to evaluate whether an act is appropriate or not, and for this reason, the ethical system is sometimes called one norm ethics, because it is taken for granted that the norm should be love. That action is right which is consistent with love. This particular school of thought is associated with the name of Joseph Fletcher and is very significant in its association with him. Now, one of the obvious questions that one might raise here is this: how do we know that love is the standard by which, the norm by which all situations are to be judged? It seems a somewhat arbitrary decision. Fletcher was an Episcopalian clergyman, although he varied quite a bit from that during his life. And of course, the scripture does say in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, God is love. And that's often interpreted the other way around, therefore love is God. But in fact, we could say it is important to know what is meant by love in that context, and that is said in the next few verses. It is not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to give himself for us. So the concept of love that is defined in Scripture as being ideal is, of course, what is called self-giving love, and that is not necessarily what Mr. Fletcher, Dr. Fletcher had in mind. Now, from those three systems, we turn to the system of natural law ethics. Which, as you will recall, is essentially a positivistic ethical system. I'm sorry, an absolutist ethical system. So that entirely wrong. It is essentially an absolutist ethical system. What is meant by natural law is defined in a number of different ways, but they generally come down to the same thing. I'm going to give three definitions, one from a classical English, ordinary English dictionary. Natural law is rules of conduct supposedly inherent in the relationships between human reason and discoverable by reason. Sorry, I think I read that wrong. Rules of conduct supposedly inherent in the relations between human beings and discoverable by reason. Law based on man's innate moral sense. Now you notice there that the rules are supposedly inherent in our nature and they are to be discovered by reason. The Cambridge Dictionary of Law, of Philosophy, provides a more accurate definition. Natural law is an objective norm or a set of objective norms governing human behavior, similar to the positive law of a human ruler, but binding on all people alike and generally understood as involving a superhuman legislator, that is, as involving God. So natural law has been represented by many, many people. The best known pre-Christian representative was Marcus Tullius Cicero. His dates are there. You see I spelled his name Tullius wrong. It's T-U-L-L. There is no I after the first U. Aristotle, the classical Greek thinker, made significant contributions. A number of Christians have been very involved in developing the idea of natural law. The Latin Catholic writer Thomas Aquinas, his dates are there. The Anglican theologian Richard Hooker, and the Armenian jurist Hugo Grotius. Among recent thinkers who have opposed natural law, we might mention Francis Schaeffer. Some of you will know the name of this man. He opposed it on the grounds that humans could not agree as to what nature requires or what God requires, and therefore it is a very, very flexible standard. For this reason, it's important to note this point one: natural law presupposes a common sense of mankind. That is, the idea that in general human beings will come to an awareness that certain things are right because they are in the order of nature and other things are not. It presupposes a generally accessible faculty of reason in the mind of human beings. And it implies, although it does not rely on the concept that there is a purposeful creation and therefore a creator. Now, in theory, natural law will be universally acknowledged. I have here a statement from the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church. Natural law is defined as the law implanted in nature by the Creator, which rational creatures can discern by the light of natural reason. It has been contrasted with revealed law, although the Decalogue has frequently been considered a part of it, excepting Sabbath observance. Cicero, whom we've mentioned as one of the prominent figures in the development of natural law, expressed this very clearly. For example, in his book, which is considered to be sort of the standard text on natural law by Cicero, called De Republica, or On the Commonwealth, he says these two things. First, nothing of all that is done on earth is more pleasing to the supreme God who rules the whole universe than the assemblies and gatherings of men associated in justice. Now you notice that although Cicero was a pre-Christian pagan, at this point he seems to presuppose that there is one supreme God. Now, here is the passage that is most frequently quoted. True law is right reason in agreement with nature. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. It summons us to duty by its commands, and it averts us from wrongdoing by its prohibitions. It does not lay its commands or prohibitions upon good men in vain, though neither have any effect on the wicked. It is a sin to try to alter this law, nor is it allowable to repeal any part of it, and it is impossible to abolish it entirely. We cannot be freed from its obligations by the Senate or the people. Now, we need not look outside ourselves for an expounder or interpreter of it. There will not be different laws at Rome and at Athens, or different laws now and in the future, but one eternal and unchangeable law will be valid for all nations and all times, and there will be one master and ruler, that is, God over us all, for he is the author of this law, its promulgator, and its enforcing judge. So we assume that there is a faculty of reason inherent in all or almost all human beings which enables them to grasp the principles of natural law. Now let me give an example. One of the commonly understood principles of natural law is that marriage should be between a man and a woman. This is, according to Christian thinking, an ordinance established by God, but it exists around the entire world. There is in the United States at the present time some talk about making it possible to have marriage between persons of the same sex. This, of course, would be a clear violation of natural law. Another principle of natural law is that parents should care for their small children. This is taken for granted around the world. It's often disregarded, it's often violated. People mistreat their children. Children are ignored and abused, but we all know that when it happens, is wrong. Natural law presupposes a nature to things, and this in turn presupposes nature with a capital N. Cicero's translator in the De Republica frequently gives the capital N to nature, which in a sense is almost saying presupposes the creator. Natural law presupposes an inherent telos, goal or purpose in the world. Now, in order to presuppose this, we more or less assume that there is a creator who has established this purpose. So obviously, while you do not need to be a believing Christian or in fact even a theist to hold to natural law, if one denies God, it generally is easy to deny natural law. That which is in accordance with nature and serves the telos is good. That which is not in such accord is evil. For example, the telos of eating should be nourishment and growth. But if one eats in such a way as not to provide nourishment, either by not eating enough or by, as is more common in our society, eating too much, then one is violating the inherent natural law. The final point that I'd like to make is that natural law ethics, natural law ethics is certainly not a system that is absolutely clear and abundantly capable of being worked out so that it will cover all of the aspects of life. But it does seem to me to be important to recognize that in many areas it is very consistent with what I've called divine command ethics or biblical ethics. Natural law is generally opposed by positivists because of the fact that it is absolutist, and even if it doesn't specifically tell you that there is a God who is a judge, it does tend to point back to a divine order and even to a personal creator and judge. Thus, it is, I think, important for us to recognize the concept that there is an order to the world. It presupposes a creator. Rational minds may differ at times about exactly how to interpret this order, but they do have an understanding of it, and therefore people in a general way can have some idea of important things that are right and wrong. Paul the Apostle does indicate this in the first and second chapters of Romans, where at the end of the first chapter he says, speaking of the Roman pagans and others, knowing therefore that they which do such things he's described a number of offenses, are deserving of death. They not only do them, but have pleasure in them that do them. Now, the point I'd like to stress there is where Paul says, knowing, therefore, that they which do such things are deserving of death. There is an awareness of the law of nature in the heart and mind of human beings. It is often distorted, it is often not well understood, but it definitely is there. I would conclude with the ancient Latin maxim, lex inveniatur non fit, or non facitur, which means lex invenitur non facitur, which means law is found, it is not made. Gustav Rodbruch, whose name was on the first slide, a German jurist who contributed to the writing of the post-war German Constitution, said the most dangerous revolution in human history came when men discovered they could make laws. It is appropriate to recognize that there are laws which are made in heaven, some of them clearly seen in revealed doctrine, such as Scripture, but many of them also understood by the light of nature, which God has planted in human minds. To quote from a secular document as my last word, the American Declaration of Independence speaks in these words. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." In other words, without making a specific Christian statement, the authors of that declaration made a statement which we would say testifies to the significance of the natural law written in nature and available to the human mind and understanding. Thank you for your attention.